My name is Bonnie B, and you are watching The Power of Perseverance. Stalking all your webpage, information, and oh my gosh, so cool. I knew a little bit that circadian rhythm was important, but I didn't understand how important. And then since the podcast episode that you did with Dr. Lyon, I have been more conscious. I even started wearing blue light blockers to the gym when I would go lift. And I noticed, I feel a difference. Not everybody's super conscious, but I make that choice. And I think that was the difference for me. And I was like, there really is something here because I am on my own healing journey. And I love that this piece has been placed in front of me. So I'm excited.
Yeah, totally. I had experience with circadian biology when I was at Princeton, like doing my PhD there. My PhD was in metabolism in one of the top metabolism research labs. So I wasn't focused on circadian biology. And just whoever, not to downplay Sachin Panda's work, but he was big in the circadian space. And I remember hearing podcasts with him and reviewing some of his work. And for whatever reason, it just wasn't clicking for me that, oh, this is really important. I was more like, oh, that's pretty cool, interesting. But I didn't personally see the direct translation to my life that much. And that didn't really happen until last spring, April 2023. I found Dr. Jack Kruse and his work. And the way that he described it, everything just started clicking for me immediately. And I had an oh shit moment where I was I just realized that so much of my focus, although everything I had learned had been important, it was not the whole story. And that this piece is actually incontrovertibly foundational to health. And if it's not dialed in, everything else will be suboptimal. And a lot of us don't even know that because we're just used to kind of maybe cruising at a baseline that's suboptimal, but you become kind of numbed out to it. But once you start to feel the difference, there's this aha moment where it's wow. And then you can't unsee it and there's no turning back because I've tried to some days I'll go out and it's bright lights. I always carry my blue blockers now, but even if I'm out super late and I'm doing activities that I would have otherwise normally been fine doing and not felt the difference, now it makes me feel sick because the body's becoming more sensitive and attuned to the light environment. And the more we're exposed to blue light at night and artificial lights, we can talk about the mechanistics, but there's this photoreceptor or light receptor called melanopsin that is a blue light detector in the skin and the eyes and the brain, also the cardiovascular system and the fat, which is interesting. But with regards to the eyes and the skin, if we're exposed to a lot of blue light artificially without that balancing effect of red and infrared like we receive from the sun, we receive blue light always with an abundance of red and infrared from the sun. That blue light by itself in a very harsh, isolated fashion is extremely detrimental to those receptors, and it starts to break them down. And so the more you're around it, the less sensitive you become because the receptors are actually breaking. And once you start to live a more light aligned lifestyle, you rebuild your sensitivity. And then it's really hard to go back to living that way because now those receptors are online and actually signaling appropriately.
That's so amazing. So you have a PhD in molecular biology from the Princeton University and an impressive array of publications in the field of biochemistry and molecular biology. I was listening to the short introductory that you do of your online course to educate people, which is so amazing. If you guys, when you're listening, you've got to go to her website, Dr. Alexis Yasmin, .wordpress. I'll put all the information there, but it was an amazing, just going through what mitochondrial health is, what it means, how important it is. And if mitochondrial health is longevity, why aren't we taking better care of it? So your journey began when you were sick as a child and then going to the gym. And I would imagine where most of us start, nutrition, macros, protein, weights, cardio, and stepping into this cycle of something new. And what's so funny, I went on a hike yesterday pondering our podcast, and I kind of just ask, all right, what can we learn? What can I pull from this? And the thought to me was, outside of my normal routine, which was that too, all weights, all cardio, all macros, what is something bigger I can learn from this about mitochondrial health? And you bring in another perspective. So let's start with where that journey began when you officially, when you first discovered, I believe it was, I've got to find his name, this book that brought you into health and wellness with Dr. Jack Kruse.
Oh,
How did,
yeah.
how did his work change your perspective?
Yeah, so for some reason, he wasn't on my radar prior to last April, even though he was doing podcasts before that as early as like 2011. He has an episode with Ben Greenfield. And it's weird because I was listening to Ben's podcast back then. And for whatever reason, maybe the timing wasn't right. The universe didn't want me to find that yet. Whoever knows, why things happen with the timing that they do. But he didn't come onto my radar until a client of mine sent me this podcast that he did with Andrew Huberman and Rick Rubin on Rick Rubin's podcast Tetragrammaton, which was last April 2023. And I started listening to it because I was like, okay, I have no idea what to expect from this, but I'm a big podcast consumer, so I was like, I'm going to check this out. And from like the first 10 minutes of him talking, I was already like very intellectually engaged. And as somebody who's been in academia for, over a decade, it takes, I would say, a lot to surprise me in science. And I was literally floored. Like, I was so surprised by this information just because not only the way he presents it, but what he's presenting is just not talked about at all by mainstream science and medicine. And it's shocking to come to that realization when you also realize that it's so important, especially from a mitochondrial health standpoint, a disease prevention, disease remediation, longevity standpoint, that this is actually fundamental stuff and it's not being talked about is kind of alarming. And so ever since, I listened to that podcast last April in 2023, I've studied probably 8 hours a day every day since then. Like, I literally just am sponging up all the information that I could in this space because I immediately realized the importance of it. And I immediately changed my own habits and my own lifestyle to revolve around these things, and immediately saw the differences and like benefits in my own health and my life. And I was already doing pretty well, but it was just taking things to the next level. And then from there, I moved on to basically restructuring my practice so that I can also convey this information to my clients and athletes. And so from there, we see incredible benefits in weight loss and reducing cravings and addictions and improving sleep quality and recovery and performance. And, your work in the gym also becomes extremely effective, especially if you make that gym outside because, well, we can talk about some mechanistics, but when you're outside, especially like barefoot on grass, let's say in the sun, you're getting a whole host of energy inputs that your body was kind of deprived of if you're working out in a gym indoors under artificial light. So specifically, when you're bare feet on the earth, you get free electrons from the earth that can help to power your mitochondria and energy production, especially during movement when you're demanding energy to be produced by your muscles. At the same time, when your skin is exposed to sunlight, especially like the UV light in the sun, that helps to allow your body to harness free electrons from the sun as well. So what happens is melanin in your skin, melanin is what gives you a tan when you're tanning in the sun. That melanin is able to split neighboring water molecules in its environment when sunlight strikes it. And those water molecules, when they're split, form 4 free electrons, molecular hydrogen and molecular oxygen. And those electrons can also power mitochondria and energy production. So completely independent of food, we're getting these two massive inputs into our energy production capacity that can be incredible fuel for exercise. Not only that, but if we have the red and infrared light from the sun as well, which morning and evening sun is basically all red and infrared light, midday sun is over 50%. That red and infrared light directly penetrates into the body, including into the muscles, to boost energy and water production at the level of mitochondria, and it's directly supporting those mitochondria. So we just get such an incredible boost in our performance and our recovery by doing that workout outside. And maybe one other thing before I'll let you maybe ask some questions is that UVA light, which we also get from sunlight, UVA light is a major stimulus of nitric oxide production in the body. And nitric oxide is what's required for vasodilation, which is what allows oxygen and nutrients to be delivered to tissues, as well as waste to be removed from tissues. And so the symphony of wavelengths of light that you receive from sunlight is just like kind of all of it's conspiring in your favor to optimize performance and health and mitochondrial function. And yet so many people, basically no one is leveraging this because we've kind of have amnesia as a species, and we just have a lot of ignorance around the role of light in regulating our biology.
I like that. I feel a difference when I'm outside. I mean, I love walking, I love running, I love hiking. And as you're talking, I'm like, you know what? It would make sense to lift more weights outside or to open up the doors at your gym, whatever. I mean, I think it makes sense. So give us a simple an explanation. What is really a circadian biology and a rhythm?
Yeah, so circadian biology refers specifically to the 24-hour cycles that our body possesses. So there's different types of cycles. There's one called like a circaseptan cycle, there's one called an ultradian rhythm, but the circadian is specifically 24-hour cycles. And in particular, there's different inputs into the body that are called Zeitgebers or time givers in German. And the Zeitgebers are what allows that the circadian clock, let's say it's specifically the master clock in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus or the SCN. That's the clock that basically tells all the rest of the body what time of day it is. And that clock is primarily regulated by cycles of light and dark. And so if you think about the evolutionary environment, when the sun is out, you're getting lots of light. The brightness of midday sun and sun throughout the course of the day is extremely bright relative to indoor lighting sources. Like you could say something like sunlight outside it could be over 100,000 lux, and then inside you might get tops 1,000. So it's huge orders of magnitude difference. And so that bright light during the day and darkness at night are equally important when it comes to circadian health and biology. So in the ancestral environment, we get that bright light during the day. When the sun goes down, we get darkness at night. There's still some moonlight and starlight, but that's very low compared to what the sun offers during the day. And so that bright light during the day from the sun and that darkness at night are what's required to tell your body, your cells, your brain what time of day it is. And that's important because depending on the time of day that's being sensed by your body, there are different functions that will be engaged. For example, at nighttime when you're sleeping, but just in general in the darkness, that's the time where the body really likes to engage in recovery, regeneration, cellular cleanup like autophagy and mitophagy. That's all happening when the body perceives darkness, because that darkness is a sign that it's basically like time to rest, time to sleep, time to renew. Versus in the daytime when there's bright light, that's the time to facilitate digestion and cognition and movement. So those are completely different processes happening during the light versus during the dark. And the problem with modern society is that because of our ignorance around the role of light and dark in our biology and our health, we now, the moment the sun goes down, everybody turns on all the lights in the house. They're still sitting on their phones, on their TVs, computers, not realizing that now they're sending the signal to their bodies that it's the middle of the day, essentially. And the main signal that's setting that circadian rhythm is blue light in particular. So midday sun is about 25% blue light, 50% red and infrared, and less than 10% UV. And that blue light is the signal that it's daytime. And so if you look at the light spectra of all of our indoor light sources, whether it's LED lights like white LEDs, fluorescent bulbs, screens like computers, TVs, tablets, phones, all of those are highly enriched in blue wavelength light because it's seen as energy efficient, quote unquote. And the energy efficiency really refers to the lack of red and infrared light, because infrared light, another word for that is heat. And so in the tech world, if your tech is emitting heat, it's seen as a waste product, even though infrared light is actually an essential nutrient for our bodies. And so you can see
Infrared light is an essential nutrient.
yes.
So if so for example, if I'm in Utah and I've got the four seasons and it gets darker at 6 p.m. versus 9 p.m., that would be optimal for me to start using some red light in the nighttime to help regulate the lack of sun I'm getting from the short days.
So I wouldn't say that. I would say biology is well tuned, especially depending on where your mitochondria hail from. If you have more northern mitochondria, like let's say your maternal ancestors came from more northern regions, you
Oh,
inherit all of your mitochondria from your mom. So the mom side of the family is what dictates your mitochondrial haplotype, it's called. So if you have more
interesting.
northern mitochondria, your mitochondria are kind of used to seasonal variation in light intensity, but also leveraging cold. Cold is what's really essential in that context, because the biology, your mitochondria are expecting, if there's not good quality sun, that you're getting cold because it would be wintertime, like you're going to be exposed to colder climates. And that cold actually compensates for the lack of sun by upregulating mitochondrial energy production and mitochondrial light production. So our mitochondria make infrared light, heat. That's what helps to keep our bodies warm. But our mitochondria also make UV biophotons, which a lot of people don't know, but it's really interesting. And that's why I like to think about specific wavelengths of light being essential nutrients, because if you think about it that way, when you're in the wintertime and there's no UV coming from the sun or very little, our bodies actually endogenously upregulate internal UV light production in response to cold in that environment. But the problem is most people aren't getting cold in the winter. Like, doesn't mean you have to be cold all day, but some targeted cold exposure during the winter months in northern latitudes is really, really helpful for helping our biology to be more synced to our environment and to ultimately be more healthy and functional. If you're sitting like without any UV light and you're also sitting like indoors and it's like 70 something degrees because you have the heat on, well, now your body's getting very mixed signals. On one hand, the temperature suggests that it should be spring or summertime, but the lack of UV light suggests that it's wintertime. So these are conflicting signals that are creating molecular chaos or inflammation. Another word for that is inflammation at the level of mitochondria, at the level of cells.
I'm hearing how even more important it is to understand your ancestral background. So if I'm, Danish, I should probably understand how that country works to understand why I'm liking the environment other places.
Yeah,
How interesting.
it is. It is. And so what I will say though is depending on where your mitochondria come from, the very equatorial haplotypes, which come from peoples who live near the equator, they have very what's called coupled mitochondria. And the coupled mitochondria are very, very efficient at making energy, but they're inefficient at making heat. And that's because in those environments, you don't need to make heat because it's warm year round. But instead, those mitochondria are very good at making energy. And that's why if you see all like the top marathoners and like these elite athletes, a lot of them have dark skin. That dark skin is associated with more equatorial regions. That means their mitochondria are just so efficient at making energy, which makes, athletic performance and pursuits extremely easy from that perspective, from an energetic perspective, versus more northern haplotypes that come from more northern regions. They're really good at making heat, not as efficient at making energy. But the caveat to that is actually those more northern mitochondria are actually more plastic, meaning they are more dynamic and changeable. So if you take somebody from Sweden and you move them down to Florida and they're there for a few years, if you look at their mitochondrial energy production, they'll actually look more like an equatorial haplotype because those mitochondria are able to adapt more dynamically to their environment. Versus somebody who has equatorial mitochondria, putting them in Sweden, we have a huge mismatch there, and those mitochondria actually didn't evolve to be able to adapt well to that environment. And I really think that this is a major underlying reason why, if you look at Black and brown communities here in the US, for example, we see a lot of health disparities. It's because of the poor quality sunlight for a period of time each year that their bodies, their mitochondria, their skin was not evolved to handle. And so I think it's just really important to bring awareness to that, because at the very least, we can start to kind of biohack our environments to a certain extent. Maybe we can add UV lights in during the winter time, maybe opt to take a vacation during the winter time somewhere you can get that good quality sun. Definitely banking vitamin D and banking UV light during the summertime when it's abundant. There's a lot of actionable things that people can do if they're in a mismatched environment from their ancestors. But the first thing is just bringing awareness to it, because I think, a lot of people will point to socioeconomic disparities driving these adverse health outcomes in these communities, and I think it plays a role. But really, in my mind, the main thing is that they're not getting enough sun. Like, I include myself too. We're not getting enough sun for our skin type. And that means, we're basically suffering the consequences because our skin is expecting a certain environment and we're occupying another one. And that also applies to anybody, even if you live in a good quality, let's say you live in Florida and you're like Latina. So just because you live in Florida doesn't mean that's enough. You actually have to be outside in Florida, because if you're indoors in Florida, your body just, it could be anywhere. It doesn't matter.
You have such an amazing high energy about you. Did this increase for you as you became more healthy, like your high energy vibration, just enthusiasm? I mean, I love it.
Yes. So I would say I'm a very passionate person. And when I'm
Yeah.
talking about something that I really believe in, and I really think is extremely important for other people to understand, I could talk for hours and days.
So, I mean, this pivotal point, like right before you had that change and you decided, I'm going to do my elimination diet, I'm going to start changing these habits in my lifestyle, did you have a little window of hopelessness where you're like, almost like you're looking over the cliff and you're not really sure which step to take and how to comprehend it? Did it feel like that step wasn't quite clear yet, but you did it anyway?
So what I'll say is that I've always been an extremely curious person, and despite all of like the health hardships I dealt with as a kid, from extremely terrible dental issues to chronic strep infections to skin issues and childhood obesity up through high school, and I ended up losing 100 pounds in high school. Lots of upper respiratory stuff, just acne, dysmenorrhea, all these things, and then an eating disorder and IBS after that. there was never a point where I felt like I was a victim to my circumstances. I always was just curious to find out why this was happening to me.
I love that you said that. You didn't
Yeah.
choose to be a victim of your circumstances. You kept the curiosity alive, and that's what bloomed.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, the more I learn about the light stuff, so I grew up in a very rural part of New Jersey, and I spent a lot of time outdoors. I spent a lot of time like hiking and just spending. I had a big piece of property, so I used to roam around there. I used to just spend a lot of time in natural light. And I think that, the more I learn about that, it really, really contributes to your dopamine status. And dopamine is this molecule not only of like reward, it's also involved in movement quality and movement ability as well. But it's also involved in your ability to critically think and see the world from a more panoramic view and not be extremely myopic and just like hyper sympathetic and hyper focused on one reality, but just seeing more possibilities. And so
Yeah.
I think that actually served me quite a bit. And I'm sure there's other factors that play too. Like I was raised in as an only child, and I was kind of like spoiled to death as a kid, and was raised in a pretty healthy environment, I would say. So I think I had pretty secure attachment. I wasn't like a super insecure child and growing up. So I'm sure that plays a role too in your ability to like see the bigger picture. But my curiosity was always just driving me to understand like why my body was behaving like this and why it was manifesting this way health wise. Because I mean, I knew I wasn't always this way. So there must be a way to either get back or become better than my starting point.
I love that. In your holistic health approach, what I understand is you did MDMA and an MDMA experience.
Mm-hmm.
And would you mind telling people about that? And do you recommend or suggest that for your personal clientele?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we're not at a point legality wise that I can necessarily suggest it, but what I can do is
Mhm.
share my story because it was very powerful. So, after I lost all the weight in high school, I went from like 270 pounds to like 170 pounds, and then I was weightlifting a lot and really got into like my fitness, and my nutrition was dialed in from like a macro calorie standpoint, but I did not have any concept of like nutrient quality and food quality. It was strictly macros. I was eating a lot of processed foods. I would say a more higher carb, higher protein diet, low fat diet. And my relationship with food after that weight loss period was just kind of wrecked because I was like operating from this place of fear. Like I didn't want to gain the weight back. So I didn't really know what to do to not gain the weight back. And so that's when I really started developing like an eating disorder. I had bulimia for like 7 years after that. And also my relationship to my body was just very odd too, because losing 100 pounds over the course of a year, that's a huge change.
Yeah.
And part of me, and I've heard this from other people too who experienced dramatic weight loss, it's like it's hard to reconcile your current body with your past body and try to like put the pieces together, especially when like you lose the weight and you end up like with excess like extra like stretched out skin and stuff, so it's not like necessarily the vision you had in mind for your body. It becomes kind of like a mind trip. And so I had a lot of body dysmorphia and disordered eating for years after that, and ultimately it was like a form of self-punishment, which is like in retrospect ridiculous because I had accomplished so much for myself and yet just wasn't fully able to accept that. And so the MDMA experience that I had, the first time I had that experience, I think it was 2018. And from the moment that like the drug came up in my system, I had like all of these like light bulb moments started going off for me where I just had a lot of like reconciliation going on internally, where I had this realization that I was literally punishing myself for doing like incredible things, and how awesome it was, how plastic my body was, how much it had an ability to be dynamic and adaptable, and yet I was here like punishing myself. And so from that moment, like I literally just healed in that moment. I From that experience, I didn't have any, eating disorder just was gone overnight. My relationship to my body and my appreciation and love for my body was just so accentuated from that moment onwards, and that was years ago now. And so I think there's an immense potential for internal healing to be had from substances like this. In particular, this one. I think other psychedelics, like the traditional psychedelics, may have their place. I certainly, actually, fun fact, the reason I went into science, I was initially in culinary school, but I had a really powerful acid experience that ended up making me pivot into science, which is maybe an aside, but I think there's immense potential for these. I think a lot of these experiences maybe people wouldn't even need to have if they're connecting with nature more and just supporting their neurochemistry by being outside in the sun, connected to the earth more. Because a lot of those drugs that people like to take our bodies make when we're outside. So when sunlight strikes your skin, in particular UV light is a really, really potent stimulator of these pathways. We make serotonin, we make the endogenous opioid molecules, the endorphins, which reduce anxiety, improve mood, also improve cognition and an ability to learn, and modulating immune function. We also make some endocannabinoids, which mimic like the cannabinoids in cannabis when we're in the sun. So a lot of those pathways are being engaged just by being outside. And I often think when I'm looking at like addictions and thinking about addictions, a lot of those issues are rooted in a disconnection from nature, because essentially the body is going to get stimulated on those pathways one way or another. And if you're not getting it from nature, you're going to seek it out elsewhere. And so on the dopamine side of things, like if you're not supporting your dopamine levels by getting those endorphins produced from UV light, you're instead going to reach for the junk food, the social media binging, the pornography, the whatever the addiction is, the drugs, the alcohol, all of those compulsions are being driven by an underlying need of your body to increase its dopamine status. And so those ways of doing things, not all of those behaviors are bad, but if they're compulsive and addictive, that's a problem, because now you're actually losing sovereignty and autonomy, and you're being overridden essentially by your urges. Versus by spending out more time outside and making those chemicals endogenously, we actually end up cruising at altitude at like higher levels of dopamine around the clock. And that allows us to just more so operate from a place of fullness, where we're not constantly being driven by our urges, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So, when were really originally connected, through Dr. Lyon and talking about the ketones, do you feel like when you took those ketones, it helped in support of that mitochondria support in any way? I'm just thinking, if you're talking about the brain and dopamine, you had said that you had studied that, and I wanted to ask you more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was at Princeton, my primary project was focused on the impact of ketogenic diet versus high carbohydrate diets, and also fasting versus feeding on tissue metabolism, like how specific tissues change their metabolism in these different states. We're
Yeah.
also studying exogenous ketones, especially in the context of cancer. So it was something that's been on my radar for a while. The first time I did a keto diet was like 2016. And so it was on my radar for a while, even before I started studying at school. And I saw some potential there, because when I was doing a keto diet, I think I stayed on it for maybe like 2 months. And I definitely noticed a lot of cognitive benefits. Like I noticed more focus, more energy. My training kind of went to crap, but that's another story. Um, but I noticed a lot of benefits cognition wise. And so when exogenous ketones started coming on the market, I got, my interest was piqued. The initial ones tasted absolutely horrific, and they were also extremely expensive. And I'm glad to see the tech has really been coming along, and it's been gaining popularity, because now like Keto 5's products are just incredible, affordable, very effective. And I'm just super stoked about them, because it makes it very accessible, especially for people who have like metabolic inflexibility or dysfunction and who can't really get into ketosis right off the bat. I see a huge benefit there to try to basically help train the tissues to being able to see ketones around in the bloodstream. And then once they get accustomed to them being around, it's much easier to then switch onto a low carb diet, or maybe engage endogenous ketosis in order to, allow yourself to burn your own fat. But up until that point, it can be really challenging for your tissues to burn ketones if they've never really seen them before. If you've been eating carbohydrates for years, you're not able to get into a good fat burning state because you have mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic dysfunction. And so it's a really nice bridge to get there. I also think from a performance standpoint, they're really useful. So I think the exogenous ketones in the context of specifically endurance sports, but just sport in general, I think there's an immense usage for them there to just help get a competitive edge. And
So
yes,
are you saying that more athletes maybe like this dual fuel concept? Because you work with performance athletes,
yes.
and your clients. So could you see this being implemented as a macro supplementation, saying, hey, you're going to have half a sweet potato and 5 grams of BHB and half an avocado? Like, is that what you envision this kind of being, instead of people thinking of it as just a supplement? Because
Yeah.
or is BHB more of like this bridge that you supplement with to have your body produce more naturally, or both?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say from an energy availability standpoint, ketones are the most efficient energy source for your tissues, for your brain, for your muscle, in at the extent of like per carbon, you're actually able to generate more ATP, like far more ATP than glucose, and ATP being that cellular energy currency. So if we can have both glucose and ketones around from a performance standpoint, this is great because the glucose is going to be able to fuel those fast twitch muscles that are more dynamic, and they're going to be more engaged if you're like doing let's say a sprint.
Yeah.
And then if you're alternating between sprinting phases and, more endurance type phases, let's say you're into cycling, or even sports like gymnastics or basketball, anything where you're going for like all out to like more of a cruising state, having the ability to be dynamic metabolically, to go from burning the glucose to the ketones and having those ketones around to fall back on, I think, I've just seen in my own practice and my own experience that it tends to dramatically reduce perceived rates of perceived exertion. So you feel like you can exert yourself more than like if you didn't take them. And I think that's a huge one, especially in whether it's the fitness community or the athletic community. If you can perform more work in a given moment, that means, you might have an edge over your competition, for example.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Um, so outside of professionally helping athletes and them connecting with you, and it sounds like you take a very holistic approach from the spiritual side to the nutrition side to the physical side. Is that right?
Yeah, I would definitely say that because, on some level, we can't separate those things, even though, we can see we have a physical body. We all have an internal experience. I would say we all should have some aspect of spirituality. And I think the most basic definition of spirituality could be the ability to be present in the moment. And so if somebody's not able to get into that present moment because they're too much, in their head, maybe they're stuck in the past or the future, then we're missing out on a lot of life, because life happens in the moment. Life doesn't happen anywhere
Yeah.
else. And so
So are
we're
you
really missing
defining
out.
spirituality? I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate because it's interesting to me, people who don't understand it. Are you saying religion is different than spirituality, and spirituality is defined as living in the moment?
Yeah, so I think they're loaded topics. And I think a lot of people had negative experiences, especially as children, with religion, organized religion. And I think what that ends up creating is people who throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that we can learn across all the religions. I think there's also some issues. My personal experience and perspective on the idea of like standard churches is that, and I think this was a Jungian quote, that like the job of organized religion is to essentially be the middleman protecting you from direct experience of God, which is funny, right? Because if you look at most of like the sins from a church standpoint, those could be experiences that can actually give you a direct experience of God, whether it's through
Yeah.
sex or substances or whatever it is. So I think, if we're thinking about the concept of God, you could just look anywhere and focus on anything, and, that he, she, whatever you want to say, will be there. But I think there's a bit of like gatekeeping in organized religion that I don't really appreciate personally. And I think we all have the opportunity to connect with whatever higher power or, being that we may think is there, that we don't actually need somebody else to facilitate that for us. That's at least my perspective on it. And from a spirituality standpoint, I think if we just think about an ability to drop into the present moment and be there with it fully, then
Mm.
experiences that you can have just by doing that are, I would say, in a lot of ways, like mind blowing relative to normal waking consciousness that a lot of people have. And that's what psychedelics also kind of make you do, is be fully in the present moment. And you're just kind of seeing all of the information that's there that you didn't perceive before because you weren't actually fully there. And yeah. So I think there's
I
like,
like getting
we have
different perspectives. I really like it. I mean, and this podcast is so open perspective, meaning like I grew up from a very religious background. It's not what I practice, but I discovered these things through my healing journey when I became more in tune with myself. So it's always fun for me to just kind of like, you know, approach these things because I've noticed each person I talk to has connected to God, universe, energy in their own way. And it's just a beautiful thing. I think it's so cool. And it's part of the whole human experience, I believe. So with that being said, what is your life philosophy around how you approach healing and helping clients?
yeah. So I would say my philosophy at this point is more so rooted in what we can take away versus what we can add. A lot of times, I think there's a big industry around selling supplements, for example, and most of them are dubious at best. Some may have benefits, like I think the ketones. I wouldn't necessarily consider them a supplement, but I think they have immense benefits in specific contexts. But the quality is very variable when it comes to other supplements, and whether you're getting what you expect to get. Also, the intended effects as well. I think there's just like a whole, let's say like I don't know. I don't know how to say it, but I just think most of them are a waste of money. That's probably the easiest way to say it. And I would much rather people spend money, let's say, building a beautiful outdoor space that they can enjoy, maybe an outdoor home office, for example, that they can spend more time outside, getting time in nature, getting, their skin in the sun, and leverage all those benefits while just doing whatever they were going to do inside, but instead doing it outside. I think that's a much better place to spend money than on some dubious supplements. And so I think just seeing how much we can simplify life, because I think people get their lives into overly complicated states. And that is one thing that can make disease probable or imminent, because the more variables there are going on, it also makes it really hard to identify what's actually having an impact on you and what's not.
Yeah.
So if we're taking 10, 20 supplements a day or prescription medications as well, then I think the first thing that I would like to do is just simplify and just try to come off everything. Obviously, prescription drugs, that needs to be really overseen by a physician, but I think just getting down to the bare bones, like nailing down the basics, is the most important thing that anybody can do to optimize their health. And that's why I actually just wrote an ebook about nailing down the basics. And the basics, as I've identified them via Jack Kruse's work, is light, water, and magnetism. Light being cycles of light and dark, water being both the water that our mitochondria make, but also the water that we're drinking, and the magnetism piece really coming into play with the presence of a lot of non-native EMFs in our modern environment, and how that's basically screwing with our body's ability to be able to detect the natural EMFs in our environment. So the natural EMFs being sunlight, the Schumann resonance, which is formed, it's like the heartbeat of the earth that's formed when lightning strikes the planet. And lightning strikes the planet, I believe it's over 100 or maybe even over 1,000 times per second. That creates this pulsing electromagnetic frequency known as the Schumann resonance. And there's also the magnetic field of the earth. So those three big pillars are all natural forms of EMF that our biology is tuned to and evolved to encounter. But in the modern milieu of non-native EMFs, our biology is losing the ability to actually sense those other frequencies that are actually important for the regulation of our biology. So for example, the Schumann resonance is equal, 7.83 hertz is equal to the alpha wave of the brain. And so the alpha wave is associated with a meditative state, with getting into a creative flow. And so the more we can connect with the Schumann resonance, the more we can actually help to regulate that own aspect of our biology as well. What I would say is the absence of connection to the natural EMFs in our environments, in combination with an abundance of non-native EMFs in our environment, whether that's from 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all of these things. These are all forms of light as well. People don't tend to think of it that way, but they're radio frequencies, so they're on the long wavelength side of things, past infrared. And our bodies detect them as light. And if you look at the research, we need way more research on this area. I think there's a lot of incentives to not do good quality research in this area, but even among the research that is there, we see that these non-native EMFs will drop resting membrane potential in mitochondria, which means the mitochondria are not functioning as well as they should, We also see that how calcium moves within mitochondria is changed in the presence of these non-native EMFs, and that calcium is associated with basically mitochondrial function as well. So there is a hit being taken by mitochondrial health and function in the presence of these frequencies. And it's really difficult because modern day, like, it's really hard to go anywhere without being exposed to these. So just the most that we can do to mitigate the effects and the intensity of these wavelengths on our body can be really helpful. So something that's important in this context is called the inverse square law, which basically states that the closer you are to a source, the more intense the effect is going to be. And so just even creating space between your body and the source of the EMFs is going to be important. So that could look like putting your phone on airplane mode when you're sleeping, or not keeping it anywhere near your bed. That could look like never holding the phone up to your ear, instead using it on speakerphone. That would look like not using AirPods, but instead using like air tube headphones, so the direct frequency is not going into your ears and your brain. Those would just be some examples. Maybe not spending time right next to the Wi-Fi router, putting it somewhere that's maybe in a room that you don't frequent as much. This would be some examples of just how to reduce your proximity to these frequencies to gain some benefits. And then, of course, the more time we can spend outside getting exposed to natural EMFs from the sun and also from our bare feet on the earth, which helps us connect to the Earth's magnetic field and Schumann resonance, then that can also help to override the negative effects of being exposed to these frequencies. So those would be some like major takeaways with regards to like the magnetism side of the equation of the light water magnetism foundation of the pyramid of health that Jack Kruse astutely has been pushing for years now and has really, really resonated with me.
What would be the final message or piece of advice that you would give people as they start out on their health journey?
Yeah, so I would say focus on light first, because light is extremely low-hanging fruit. There's so many behaviors that we have today that aren't conducive to health and aren't consistent with the evolutionary landscape, that if changed, we can get immediate benefits that help to build momentum in the positive direction that will help you to make more positive changes moving forward. And light is the big one because that directly influences our dopamine status, our ability to actually have willpower and discipline. So in my book, I talk about willpower and discipline being biochemical. It's not just a matter of forcing yourself to do the thing. If your neurochemistry is off, you're not going to have the willpower you need to actually enact your goals. And so you can use willpower to a certain extent, but you're always going to run up against issues. It's going to be an uphill battle unless you optimize that neurochemistry. And optimizing your light environment is the easiest way to do that. So what that would look like is, as soon as you wake up in the morning, try to go outside, get your bare feet on the earth, and just view some morning sunlight. Even if it's only for a couple minutes, ideally you could be out maybe 15, 20 minutes, but even if it's only 2 to 5 minutes, it's way better than not doing it at all. Then during the day, if you take breaks, natural light breaks as much as you can. Note that glass in windows filters out about 100% of UV light and about 40% of near infrared light. So just by sitting inside behind glass, you're exposed to artificial light that's enriched in blue. And that's even without putting light bulbs on or being on screens. So if you can crack a window or you can opt to work outside, those are really easy things that you can do to just help optimize your daytime light environment. If you can't do those things, you can buy lights to use indoors that will help to round it out. For example, you could use like a red and infrared light panel. There's also the Chroma Sky Portal, which has basically a full spectrum bright light that you can adjust the redness of, so you can turn it more red throughout the day and helps to mimic outside. You can use lizard lights, which are UVB. Black lights are UVA. So those are some like things you can kind of put in your space to help at least get some of the same stimuli that you would receive from the sun. Obviously, it's not as good as the sun, but it's still better than doing nothing at all. Using full spectrum light bulbs when you can. So most white LED bulbs are highly enriched in blue and devoid in red and infrared light. But you can buy full spectrum light bulbs from places like Bon Charge, and there's other ones as well, that basically add the red and infrared back in so that you're still getting more of a full spectrum light. Incandescent bulbs used to be much better, but now they're being banned in the US. We can't even buy them anymore. They're highly enriched.
I said, goodness, I can't.
I know. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But they're really enriched in red and infrared light and barely have any blue light at all. They're being banned because they're energy inefficient. But like I said, they're providing those essential nutrients in the form of red and infrared light. And so if you can get full spectrum bulbs or incandescent bulbs, if you can get your hands on them, you can use those indoors. And then starting at sunset, if you go out, watch sunset, I think it makes life more romantic and aesthetic anyway. If you can see sunrise and sunset, it's great for, I would say, just well-being. And you're also getting that bolus of red and infrared light to support your mitochondria. And then after sunset, that's when you really want to be diligent about blocking blue light. So wearing 100% blue blocking glasses. If you're going to be on screens, I would recommend downloading Iris or Flux, which are programs you can put on your computer to filter out blue light, and some flicker. Flicker is like all LEDs have some level of flicker where, for the most part, you're getting this rapid flicker of the light that actually stimulates your sympathetic nervous system. And so, of course, at nighttime, we don't want to do that. And in general, the less we can do that, the better, except obviously if we're engaging in sport or something serious, we want to be able to engage the sympathetic branch of the nervous system when it's appropriate and not just be cruising there at a baseline, because that's what burns us out. So wearing the 100% blue blocking glasses, those should have a dark orange lens. That's how you know that they're good. There are daytime blue blockers that you can use if you're under a lot of artificial light or on screens all day. Those block about 60% of blue light, and they have a yellow lens. But the dark orange ones are going to be the ones you want to wear starting around sunset. And then after that, if you come to my house at nighttime, my whole house is lit with red lights, even my porch, my front and back porch. Our TV, if we're going to watch TV at night, we go into the advanced settings and we turn on the red mode. There's like an RGB mode, so the whole TV is red, so we can watch TV without getting blasted with blue light. Just some tips and tricks. And then if you're going to be on your phone, there's also native settings on iPhones that you can change your phone tint to like an amber or a red color. And I have a reel on my Instagram, shows people how to do that. So those will just be some easy tricks that people can do basically right away for very cheap, and or free in some cases, by just leveraging outside in the sunlight and then turning off lights at night and getting exposed to as little light as possible after dark. Are some really simple ways that you can feel better, like immediately. I used to think I was a night owl, and the day I started implementing this stuff, I just got naturally sleepy about an hour or two after sundown. I would just naturally wake up early. And that's how our biology is meant to be. It's very simple, very simple. One other thing I would say, if somebody, has paler skin and they're not used to going outside in the sun, I recommend doing what Jack Kruse says is called building a solar callus, which basically building up your tolerance to midday sunlight over time, so you're not burning yourself, so that you're going to be able to harness the benefits of the sun without the drawbacks. And I have a pinned post on my Instagram that people can learn how to build their solar callus, as well as in my ebook, I outline everything that you basically want to enact within the realm of light, water, magnetism, mitochondrial health. It's 92 pages, very visual, very, succinct. And I've gotten really good feedback from it. It's basically, I even have like my stepson reading it. I have other families reading it with their children. It's literally written for anybody, like anybody over like 10 years old could read this and be able to enact these positive changes. And so if somebody's interested to learn more, they can also check that out.
And where can they find you? On Instagram, Facebook, and your website?
Yes. So I'm primarily on Instagram at Dr. Alexis Jasmine, Jazmyn. I have a Facebook, but it's basically like I don't use it ever. I've actually been meaning to deactivate it, honestly. My website, yes, is there as well. And in the link in my bio on Instagram, you can see where the ebook is. I also have courses and other offerings that people can check out if they want to be in my space more. And I post almost every day, lots of good free information that, even without buying anything, you can completely and radically change your life by just going through my content. My free content, there's also a free lesson on light. If you go to my link in bio, they can download that. It comes with a free circadian checklist, and also a circadian optimization protocol as well. So there's lots of free resources. People can check them out. A lot of the actionable takeaways as well are also free or very inexpensive. So there's basically no gatekeeping or paywall for this information and for these lifestyle behaviors, which I think is the most important thing, because a lot of times, you see people in this maybe like the biohacking space or the health and wellness space, like recommending these pieces of equipment or products that are thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars. And it's like, people can't really afford this. Like everyday people can't, but this information, everybody can leverage to receive benefits.
I love that. I would think that working with you would be more like of a support system and then understanding the deeper knowledge after the free information resonates with that person. And thank you so much for joining me on this and putting this information out here. I know if I had heard this for me personally, I have been looking for more because of that curiosity. So I'm so grateful that we could do this and I could put this out there to help more people. Thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you. Thank you for having me on. This was really fun. And I like talking about the spiritual side of things too, because barely anybody ever asked me that. And I would say it's an important part of my life too that I don't share as often. So it was nice to talk about that. And yeah, just like thinking about the all of the ways that light, water, and magnetism shape our reality and actually our ability to connect with source, the divine, God, however you want to conceptualize it, because the more we can optimize our biology, the more we can easily drop into the present moment and connect with other people, connect with, creator, nature, the universe, however you want to conceptualize that. And
Yeah.
so the spiritual landscape also becomes very rich once you get these things in order.
I so agree with that. And I think that's a beautiful note to end and summarize all of this on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, please share it and help us keep the conversation going. We can't grow without you. So thank you in advance for your support of Power of Perseverance.